higher perspective. Your host, Harry Wilkins. Hello and welcome. My name is Harry Wilkinson, and this is the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks, events, happenings in the world, happenings on our planet, internationally, in politics, in technology, in the environment, in entertainment. Sometimes we even talk about sports, whatever it is that is maybe grabbing our attention or that we're interacting with throughout the week. We take a step back and we look at it from a higher perspective. Because as we know, often when we are bombarded, as we often are, by media with stories, news stories that are intended to maybe at best titillate, often to scare or provoke or simply grab attention. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel as though things around us, things in the world, are coming apart at the seams, and it gives us a feeling of frustration or even paralysis, because these events seem so much larger than ourselves that we feel like we cannot affect those, and that in fact the opposite is happening, that they are affecting us. And often we let them affect us by having reactions to them that are not helpful. I know many a spiritual seeker talks about disconnecting from media and not paying attention to it, and I think it's a very good idea to take a break from media whenever and wherever you can. However, I don't think breaks are enough, media breaks are enough, and unless you're willing to live on a mountaintop, you're not going to be able to disconnect from the ever increasing bombardment of media that we're going to be exposed to. You can minimize it, and that's a good thing, but it will always be there. And in fact, the whole premise of what I do here on this show is based on the idea that, in fact, it's not a good idea to do that. In fact, you're missing a great opportunity, because when you are confronted with these experiences, these situations, these stories, rather than disconnect from them, you have the opportunity to go inside, to feel what it is that is making you feel uncomfortable, and to take energy from it, to recognize the truth of what it is, that it's not real. In a very literal sense, it is not real, that we are creating these situations on a much higher level, and that how we approach them, what we think about them, the energy that we give or do not give to them, changes them radically. Just changing your perspective on how you see something, how you react to something, changes that something. What we know from quantum physics now is that what is observed, what is interacted with, is changed by the observer. There isn't any real thing as objective observation. It is all what we are creating. And what we are creating is ultimately leading us to a greater awareness, connection or reconnection with our highest selves, and an understanding or remembrance of the truth of who and what we are, and how powerful we are. That we are not these limited beings in limited bodies, that we are not weak and powerless, but in fact we are the creators. And of course these the situations that we create here in the so-called real world, which is really the illusory world, but it's the world we create, the world where we play the human game, can seem, my goodness, so intimidating. We can really create scenarios that are that can shake you to the core. And those are the moments when you need to take the step back, and that you need to recognize the truth, and that these situations, problems, whether they are international, worldwide, or personal, they do not have power over you. So that's what this show is about. And we talk about how to change your perspective on these things. And I hope that in what I share on the show, which is basically just something I share with me to help me remember, and by doing it on podcast, hopefully it reaches some people and has some helpful effects for others as well. So in recent weeks we've been talking about consciousness. What is consciousness? We've been talking about changing consciousness. We've been talking about the upsurge in research on not only consciousness, but on the reemergence of testing, scientific testing, using psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin and so on. And we've been talking about this book on changing minds, and how the study of the effects neurologically on people who are having transcendent experiences that are triggered by chemicals such as psilocybin, which is the primary ingredient in magic mushrooms, or lysergic acid, which is LSD. This research helps us to understand more about the nature of consciousness, because as we've discussed, consciousness is something that is still to a large degree a mystery, certainly among scientists. As far as science is concerned, traditional science, we still don't know what consciousness is or where it is. And research up until now has been only minimally interested in finding, answers to those questions. Recent studies in neurology, show how the brain works and brain waves, and there's a belief that consciousness has something to do with that, with how the transmitters in the brain work, and that consciousness is somewhere in there. But because consciousness is something that's not particularly measurable, science is, the way science is right now, the scientific approach that we have right now, will have great difficulty looking into that. There are only certain things you can measure. You can measure how the brain responds to something. You can measure what neurons are doing when a monk is meditating, but that only tells you so much. That will only ever tell you so much. But those are the limits of science. That's why science is not particularly good at studying things like consciousness or things like intuition, the connections that minds may have with one another. Science doesn't look at it, doesn't want to look at it, doesn't think it exists in many situations. And those brave researchers who have sort of broken through and begun to do studies on this risk their reputations, their careers, because of the extreme bias against people, researchers, scientists, who have a belief in these things and want to find out more about them. There's a culture of intimidation. There's a culture of dismissiveness among traditional science because it doesn't fit in with their worldview. So I think these are the ways that and the reasons why there's been limited research on things like consciousness. This is changing, as we've been talking about in these experiments using the psychedelics, and the wonderful research paper that we talked about, which explains how these transcendent experiences, these mystical experiences, are actually very important for human existence, for human health. In exploring consciousness, at our highest level, we have a connection, we have an understanding that science can't even begin to give us about what consciousness really is. But just to talk about consciousness isn't enough, because often we want to be able to change our consciousness, what we are aware of. We can talk about consciousness in a variety of contexts, but today we're just going to talk about it as what we are aware of. If we are looking for problems, if we are looking for pain, if we are looking for discomfort, that's what we'll find. And we have a consciousness and awareness of these things, if that's how we see the world. But if we change our consciousness, if we take that step back I was talking about, if we look at the world in a different way, if we look at ourselves in a different way, with the idea of peace and calm and balance in the face of whatever, with the understanding that these creations do not have power over you, you can change your consciousness to one that works better for you, a consciousness of peace. Peace that starts with having a peaceful heart, and that extends to a peaceful environment that you create for yourself. And then as you go out and interact with others, that sense of peace has an effect. Just as in quantum physics, what the observer does, what the experimenter does,